very own professor, Josef Laszlowski, from the Department of Medieval Studies. Without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Francis Mickus, who is to present his paper called From CNN to YouTube, Henry V in the Digital Age. Please.
Before you start, I'm sorry, Francis, just a few sentences also as chair. I also would like to greet you, and first of all, I offer you an explanation. It should have been Gabor Kloniczai who chairs this session, but like many other things during the last year had to be changed and reorganized because of COVID, and in this case, it's actually vaccination. So that's why I'm chairing this session, and Gabor is going to chair the afternoon session. It would have been absolutely appropriate that Gabor chairs this session because it's about medievalism and nationalist symbolism, and Gabor Kloniczai was a leader of a research project some years ago, which was about the uses and abuses of Middle Ages. And one of the main topics of that research project was also how nationalism, how national ideas, how national symbols are using medieval concepts, are using real or distorted images of the Middle Ages. So it's a very relevant topic. It did not stop to be an interesting question. So I'm glad that I can chair this session. I also dealt a little bit with some aspects of this session, and I'm very much looking forward to hear all your contribution. I hope that we will have an interesting session, and at one point, if the presentations are going very long, I will make a sign that probably time is over. I don't think that it will be necessary, but we would like to keep definitely time for the discussion. And as Reverend has already mentioned, our first speaker is, in this case, Francis. And Francis is doing studies at Paris University, Sorbonne Panthéon Paris 1. And in the focus of his studies are other things, but it seems to be that medievalism is a key issue and concept for the understanding of his topic. So it's not probably simply a kind of byproduct, but this is talking about how academic research dealing with the actual Middle Ages should also deal with present perceptions, interpretations, and maybe also some cases misinterpretations. With this, I pass the word to him. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, first thing is, hello everybody. Thanks for having me come to your, well, virtually come to your conference. I'm actually very proud of this. First things first, I'm going to make sure that you see what I'm going to do. Okay, I come back to do the technical stuff. Share screen. Do you see my screen? If that works.
No, we can.
No, you don't see your screen. Thing is, I don't see you if you tell me. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. I have been muted.
No, you are not.
No.
We can.
I hate these computers.
We are waiting for your
screen share.
Screen share, yes.
I popped screen share, and let me do full screen. And is that working? I think so. Hold on.
If you go to slideshow, then it will be really full screen.
Presented speaker. Okay. I hate
in the bottom of the screen.
Yeah.
Francis. No, from the beginning. In the same bar that you were clicking, the very left one where it says from beginning. Clicking.
Yes. Hold on. Come back to full screen here. Such a technical dunce. It's terrible. I don't even know how to get back to the full screen here anymore. Hold on. Here we go. Okay, up here I should have a new share.
Francis, again, if you see on your screen on the gray bar that is beneath the orange one, the very left symbol says from beginning. Click on that one.
Okay, from beginning. If not, it doesn't matter. I will just not use my images. They're not necessarily important. From beginning. Actually, there we go. There we go.
There.
Okay, back up. I always get confused. There we go. You should be able to see my screen now. Perfect. Okay. As I said, thanks for having me over. Here I am, presenting you Henry V in the digital age, which is actually probably a bit more vast than that, because it all starts with Olivier's film in 1944. Oh, darn, what happened? Ah! Du calme, mes enfants, mais du calme. Voilà. Page there. It's interesting. Why is... Okay. You see, it starts going on its own. I don't really want to do that. And so, it starts with Olivier's film in 1944. Oh, well, screw it. You will not have my pictures because I never can handle these things perfectly, and it drives me crazy. So anyhow, 75 years ago, Laurence Olivier launched his 1944 Henry V, and to this day it remains the template to filming Shakespeare's play. It is so pervasive a structure that not only Orson Welles reused the same structure in 1966 for his Falstaff, making it something of a noir counterpoint to Olivier's Technicolor extravaganza, the three subsequent adaptations also followed the basic structure, with the Battle of Agincourt at its core. And even Anne Curry's 2015 MOOC course on Agincourt followed Olivier's play. What had changed over the years are the attitudes towards war and towards heroism. More ill at ease with the warlike Harry, Branagh's 1989 version presents a darker Henry, and the play becomes much grittier. After Vietnam, after the Falklands, war is politically less pleasant. It's much more questionable. Western Europe had not seen war since Olivier's day, and it continues for the following 20 years. And when Peter Papadakis did his version in 2004, it was wedged between two Gulf Wars, but the play again serves as a metaphor for media manipulation. Finally, the BBC adapts the play in 2012 as part of the Hollow Crown series, and that explores the toll of wars on people themselves. In short, each film sums up prevalent attitudes to the times. Now, Henry V, both as a historical subject and as a stage play, therefore becomes an effective barometer to measure not only attitudes towards current events, particularly wars, but also for the attitudes towards how media depict these events and the three-way relationship between media, audiences, and the basic power structures that use media for political ends. This paper, therefore, spends as much time, in fact, considering recent history as the way King Henry V, as a play, served as a response to those events. Okay, any desire to control the media is met with an equal artistic as well as an audience reaction. And this is true if you do in your American film history for the Hays Code, as it is for general government censorship. The 20th century, I should say, is the last century where informational and entertainment media flow predominantly from providers, be they the press, be they the film, be they radio or television, to audiences. With the advent of the internet, that single direction becomes less apparent. Content providers also become content users, audience reactions, responses, and conversations become an essential aspect of media input. This is basically how Facebook works when you think of it. The use of Henry's persona is adapted to these new media, and as this paper will again demonstrate, Henry is the metaphor. It is also how he used for general popular perception. Now, Of course, since Caesar wrote his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, wars have always been fought on a cultural front. There has always been a cultural desire to assert the moral and political justification of a given war. The last 2 centuries have seen the apparatus expand. Henry V is a play that has exploited that. The 19th century saw elaborate stage productions, which often, by the way, foreshadow Olivier's film, as well as the proliferation of images in the variety of media, from stained glass to ceramic figures. There's even a teapot somewhere. In World War I, wanted to control information. World War II marshaled all of Hollywood to its cause. You can think of Frank Capra's Why We Fight series. But at the same time, you would have people who would make fun of that. You had Preston and Sturges doing Hail the Conquering Hero. You have the Vietnam War, which talks about war on television, but we remember it in the States through the series MASH. Now, the century ends with the golden age of cable. And this is where it gets interesting, because with that concurrent explosion of channels comes a series of specialized channels. The most famous of which is the cable news network in the United States, which is a news network, which becomes a full-time news network. Now, in the States, radio had already undergone a similar transformation. So you had these specialized radios where one of the radio stations had the slogan, give us 22 minutes and we'll give you the world, over and over again. But what happens with that, what wasn't expected, however, is CNN's, you might say, great stroke of luck, because CNN came just at the time of the first Gulf War in '91. There was a dramatic congressional debate. There were people saying no blood for oil. The votes were shown on television, but the war itself only lasted about 6 weeks. In short, that was a brilliant television show. The New York Times columnist Richard Bernstein titled his editorial, "What will the Gulf War produce enduring art?" It was a war so carefully scripted, he explains, for television that it was, in a way, already a movie. It's hard to imagine what a filmmaker could do with the war itself, and previous movies haven't already done it so. In some ways, he quotes Oliver Stone saying, well, Tom Cruise already did the Persian Gulf War with Top Gun. Okay, wars have become so short that it becomes impossible to think about them, let alone criticize them. And we might remember the Gulf War as a footnote. Now, CNN's handling is a media manager's dream. The First World War under Woodrow Wilson tried to do the same thing, but there were labor movements against it. Even Chaplin would spoof the war, even though he would sell war bonds. But it can only be effected in a very short war like the First Gulf War. But that war is something of an exception. The critiques we get to the war come afterwards. The film Wag the Dog or David O. Russell's 2003 King. You don't really get films that during the war itself criticize what's going on, as happened in the 40s with Michael Powers' 1943 Colonel Blimp. Churchill hated that film so much that he personally got involved in Olivier's production of Henry V as a response. But what happens with the Gulf War is, well, one wonders, one critic, Ian Aitken put it, says, one wonders whether Branagh's film might not have had more relevance if it had been released against the background of the possible Gulf War. But that's exactly what happened. Branagh's production is in 1989, which is about 18 months before the war starts. It is the version that illustrates and criticizes a finding a war we can win atmosphere, which permeates that first Gulf War. The Gulf War, finally, ends very tidily with people thanking their troops, and there was this song called Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree, and people literally tied yellow ribbons around their old oak trees to greet the troops going home. So if there's any criticism of the Gulf War, it's essentially criticism of a second Gulf War, which, by the way, is still grinding on today. Note, what happens is, and that's where we come with Bacchus's version. So again, we have a new version of Henry V exploiting that thing, is a direct response to the CNN style of war reporting. And it's Sarah Hattrell. I couldn't find the original blog post. I think they took it down. But Sarah Hattrell reported that Bacchus said that the depiction of the Battle of Agincourt ought to look like CNN coverage of all the wars that go on today, with all the chaotic, unplanned shocks that appear in real documentary footage of the so-called embedded video journalist. In short, again, by the way, I have you note that Bacchus is reusing Olivier's structure. But coming back to the embedded journalist, and that's the most interesting thing, is because, well, that is nothing new. We have embedded journalists, there are famous radio journalists like that, too. But again, the image of the embedded journalist is the image of Branagh's Henry V, where Derek P. Royal points out how that chorus goes from a Brechtian distance to an admiring observer. Excuse me. Blah, blah, blah. The key swing, of course, happens in the Battle of Barfleur. I would have liked to have shown you the scene that where the chorus, like a television war correspondent, starts getting really excited, starts sewing up, and responds in the frenzied nature of the battle, and is presenting it as if he is presenting it from the edges. And from then on, the tone changes. And as Royal puts it, the abrupt and jarring nature of Jacobi's performance is replaced by one that more gently intrudes on the scene upon which he comments. Derek Royal sees this as something of a missed opportunity to use the chorus as a critique of the events of the play. But another more troublesome reading can be derived from this analysis, one that recalls an earlier film, Peter Watkins' 1964 film around the Battle of Culloden, which is the invasion of Scotland, by the way. Branagh's chorus initially appears distant, neutral, it's a conveyor information, but as the film progresses, is subtly sucked into Henry's way of thinking. The unbiased journalist unwittingly becomes mouthpiece of official doctrine. Now, if those who read the play, this runs counter to Shakespeare's own chorus, who from the start is the mouthpiece. It is the chorus and not the play for whom Shakespeare is the mythmaker. The chorus, as Andrew Gurr dryly notes, is a great painter of pictures, but they're never the pictures shown on the stage. What then should be the nature and degree of mismatch between chorus and play? And what is the chorus's role if not considered akin to a modern-day journalist? If the chorus is to be a journalist, then we have a problem, because we can use Capra's films again, where he shows journalists as crass, opportunistic, insensitive. They have a sense of self-importance that believes that their jaded view is objectively accurate. But a journalist never lies. What Shakespeare suggests, on the contrary, is that journalists do lie. They transmit as truth that which they patently know is false. And this is, for democracy, extremely unsettling. It is almost so much so that it's almost inconceivable. The only major film in the great Hollywood era to discuss that was Wells' Citizen Kane. Now, we can use the problem of lying. It comes a little earlier than this, because it comes back to the Iran-Contra scandals in the earlier 80s. But the idea that wars and policies were the product of political manipulation, which journalists and journalism in generally played a willing and active part, was one that was ready to take shape at the end of the century. And in fact, it's part of what feeds the internet. For though the internet is basically coming into form, into shape. It's the early 90s where we see the first powerhouse, America Online in the United States. It is where we have a number of search engines coming up, Yahoo being the most famous. But it comes into its own in the new century. Access becomes simpler and access becomes more powerful. Information which in the 90s would take hours to download now can take minutes and probably doesn't need to be downloaded at all. Look at streaming. We don't even bother to download the films anymore. It is a revolution whose impact cannot be overemphasized. Historians, particularly art historians, before becoming a historian, I was an art historian, have access to images and information at unprecedented levels. Virtually all the works and virtually all the empire things that I'm just as an example come from the internet for me. So it really is an important source of information. But is that actually a good thing? Access to images, for instance, is so massive that it becomes impossible to verify. And I've come across that problem. Again, studying Henry V. You have the British Library, which does wonderful work, has great downloads. It offers a whole history, the great vital statistics of an image, but it hasn't been kept up in 10 years. One of the examples that I use, the last entry for the bibliography dates to 2011, which goes to show you how labor-intensive, in fact, such work is, and how much that labor is hidden from us. We take things for granted, but we forget that. And where it becomes problematic is when we're dealing with more business ventures like Bridgman Images. You've probably heard of that site as well. And I found a picture of that, which they say is Henry V, but there's absolutely no way to prove it. And so we find ourselves with this massive information that people use and disseminate and never really worry about. When you type Agincourt, you'll discover that web pages say virtually anything. There's Anne Curry's MOOC that I told you about, but there are about 5 or 6 others I can tell you about. There are YouTube videos. There's some fun little finger puppet videos I'd seen as well. There are blogs. There are the History Channel does its stuff, and you have television downloads. You can get anything you want, but it's all on the same level, and it's all impossible to verify unless you work on it. You would expect such information to be a good way to expand knowledge, but it's in fact the opposite that is true. Rather than seek out information that challenges our assumptions or our knowledge, the very practices of the internet tend to reinforce our preconceptions. You might say a form of planetary groupthink sets in. As I say, type the Battle of Agincourt, read the articles, and you will see that basically they all say the same thing. English pluck, English longbowmen, and good leadership helped the British win the day. It also tells you that it's a great way to irritate the French is just to talk about Agincourt. But when you look at the images, it becomes even more complicated because almost all of these sites do basically the same thing. They either post a medieval manuscript, they never tell you which one, they'll post or a 19th century picture, often an engraving that's been colored and things like that. Actually, at the time, some of them are pretty good, actually. And they'll have a picture of the famed Henry V profile that's usually from the National Portrait Gallery. But again, they never tell you what it is, where it comes from, and why they use that. And sometimes they make mistakes and never notice it. In one of the posts that I saw, they offered a portrait of the French king, Charles VI. Well, the problem was, the portrait they gave us was of the Habsburg emperor, the 17th century one, Charles VI. So, and you never know that. It's in the Story of the Underdog, if you're curious to look for it, but it's there. So you get the basic information. You always get the basic same information, and then you get wrong pictures. But what does that say about use of images on the internet? Well, quite a bit. That the internet may offer interesting advances in history, but it becomes an echo chamber of cliches, which leads us to a very surreal vision of history. One that sometimes has little to do with fact. And again, it comes up in another depiction of Henry V, which is the Netflix production by David Minchot, which is called The King, which is ostensibly a fusion between, you might say, the biography of Henry V and a condensation of Shakespeare's Henriade set in a modern language. It'd be interesting things to say about that, but what happens is it has absolutely nothing to do with reality. For instance, what has happened as I'm going and studying Henry V, Again, websites do give infringement. Is they were talking about the weapon, the arrow wound that Henry had received at the Battle of Shrewsbury. Well, the Battle of Shrewsbury in the King is two armies lined up, and the two major characters, Harry Hotspur and Hal, Prince Hal at the time, who basically have a single combat on foot, by the way, and Henry stabs Hotspur. Fine, but the problem with that is Henry doesn't get a war wound in his face, yet later on in the film we see the arrow wound, and it's never explained. Another problem with that, for those who've read, is the character of Falstaff, who basically becomes the Duke of York and dies like the Duke of York in the Battle of Agincourt. So what happens is we kind of have this kind of internet reinvention of history as well as of Shakespeare. Which leads us to, as you might have noticed, my own viral and highly emotional user response, the user responses that come up and that feed the internet. One post is followed by hundreds of comments, which leads up to another post, which is followed by another 100 comments, but which creates not so much as a conversation as a series of personal points of views, which become a written shouting match. And some of the Facebook discussions can be quite fun about that, but they're very nasty as well. So what happens is, again, the practice spills over, but what happens is everybody worries about how I feel. And we have a problem of personal response to a given situation. And this becomes the crux of the Hollow Crown version, according to analyst Ramona Ray. She points out that it is no longer a story, the play, again, we're readapting, quote unquote, Henry V, according to our current perceptions. The current perceptions are not so much the responsibility of those in power when later, but rather a vision of war that embeds a human experience divorced from the larger questions of political accountability. Ray, as I say, explores how the film discusses the issues of post-traumatic stress that is prevalent in contemporary Iraq war films.
Francis, I'm sorry to interject. You have 2 minutes left.
I have 2 minutes. Well, I'm pretty much there. So, well, which leads us to the problem. Let's see, my last page. Yeah, that's pretty much it. As I say, the internet highlights the problem of dealing with Henry V and the Lancastrian dynasty. Historians tend to read the era in a contemporary light. Now, by the way, it only highlights it because it happened before. You have earlier books like Francis Woodman, which will use the term propaganda when discussing the Canterbury Screen. Well, one wonders, does the word really apply? But it also, I think, in general, historians should know better, because applying modern concepts to a historical time is difficult. When Fernando Armesto, who is an Oxford historian, says that Henry began on the field of Agincourt a career as a war criminal, massacring prisoners in defiance of the conventions. The problem is, what conventions is he talking about? Because another historian, Craig Taylor, pointed out that medieval commentators, even from the French side, did not attack Henry V for his actions. So they would not have been war crimes in the 15th century. They would have been war crimes today. That's not the same thing. So the face of Henry is always in profile, which is always what we get, half of the story. Which is why I think the best thing to do in all our problems is just kind of log off, think about what you've read, and maybe start by rereading Shakespeare. Because in Shakespeare's play, Agincourt doesn't appear except as a joke, when one Mountbatten takes a coward prisoner, and that is it. Shakespeare writes a play in which the chorus is contradicted by the play itself. In short, Shakespeare writes a play as a warning against media manipulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francis, for this very interesting presentation, and starting from Shakespeare and coming back to Shakespeare. and also underlining that it's still useful to read Shakespeare, although we have
Always.
amazing interpretations of the same story over and over again.
Yes.
With that, we would like to move to our second presentation, and this will be presented by Anne Tastad, who's from the University of British Columbia. She's a master student in this program, and in fact, this is her very first, let's say, formal presentation in an international, of course, in this case, online conference. And we are very much looking forward to this. You need to start somewhere, and I'm sure that you will go on and do many other similar presentations in the future. But she has got already experience with organizing, for example, an informal academic conference. We have just heard about the role of Facebook and other things. This was actually on Instagram Live. And she's now completing her master thesis, which is on the image of the fairies in the Middle Ages or in the Middle English literature. And today she's talking about heresy, but heresy from a different point of view. It's a folklore-inspired aspect dealing with this question. We are very much looking forward to that, so the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Let's see. One second. Here we go. Okay, so before I get going, I just wanted to say thanks for having me and thanks for that introduction. As you pointed out, this is my first conference, so I'm a bit nervous, but hopefully everything goes fine. And I also wanted to say that I have a timer right here set to exactly 23 minutes. So I will be very keenly aware of time, and I'll do my best to stay within those bounds. So without further ado, I'm just gonna dive right in. So the title of my paper is Heresy, a Folklore-Inspired Streetwear Brand Refashions British Heritage. History demonstrates that fascination with the vernacular traditions of rural Britain is something of a tradition in and of itself. The study of Britain's ancient beliefs, customs, and artifacts originates with early modern and Victorian scholars who saw folklore as the product of rural communities where ancient beliefs and customs were preserved, frozen in a kind of quasi-pagan time warp. Seen as an authentic reflection of cultural heritage, folklore was often used to support ideas about national identity. While 21st century scholars no longer view folklore as ancient and rural, in the less formal context of pop culture, folklore continues to be portrayed in precisely such terms. I argue that these misrepresentative media portrayals of folk culture function to discursively reinforce a restrictive and fundamentally inaccurate understanding of Britain's cultural heritage, perpetuating by extension a similarly restrictive understanding of British national identity. The narrow conceptions of British heritage and identity are potentially harmful is particularly evident when considering that within Britain, Brexit and increased transnational migration across Europe has contributed to an increase in nationalism and xenophobia, and an attendant increase in so-called bordering processes, social and cultural practices of differentiation, which construct and perpetuate borders between insider and outsider, us and them. Frequently, these bordering processes weaponize the past by using misconceptions about Britain's cultural heritage as the flawed basis for adjudicating who does and does not qualify as truly British. Thus, by perpetuating outdated and misrepresentative portrayals of vernacular culture, folkloric media contributes to broader sociopolitical bordering practices that positions Britain's heritage and, by extension, British identity as exclusive and monolithic. However, I'm also going to be demonstrating that not all folkloric media functions in this way with these effects. After first analyzing several examples of restrictive folkloric media, I conduct a contrasting analysis of HERESY, a London-based streetwear brand that takes design inspiration from British folklore. Heresy uses pastiche and juxtaposition to create self-reflexive designs that foreground the hybrid nature of British heritage and identity. I suggest that by acknowledging and celebrating hybridity, heresy challenges static and exclusionary constructions of Britishness. At a time when the status of British heritage and British identity are deeply contested, it's worth considering the sociopolitical value of media that reframes, or in this case, refashions, these things as accessible, ongoing processes that anyone is invited to participate in. So, interest in Britain's folklore can be traced to the early modern period when scholars known as antiquarians began to investigate, quote, the relics of a lost world past, unquote, collecting, studying, and preserving the material and oral traces of Britain's pre-modern heritage. In 1846, the antiquarian W.J. Toms first uses the term folklore, effectively formalizing antiquarianism as the field of folklore studies. By the Victorian period, the growing sentiment in Britain was one of, quote, revulsion against increasing urbanization and industrialization, unquote. Victorian society's resistance to the effects of modernity engendered a desire to, quote, retreat into the myth of Merry England, unquote. What Gillian Bennett describes as, quote, a largely imaginary heritage which the Victorians sought to restore and place at the center of national cultural life, unquote. As Bennett's words suggest, early perceptions of folklore were often romanticized and inaccurate. So, tracing the shift from early modern antiquarianism to Victorian folkloristics, what remains consistent is the view that folklore was a set of beliefs and practices that were found exclusively in, quote, groups which were by common consent regarded as the repositories of historic continuity and tradition, such as peasants, unquote. The agrarian working classes situated in remote rural communities were seen as uniquely segregated and thus protected from any outside influence or alteration. It was assumed that rural culture was, quote, static, untainted by urban sophistication, and thus likely to preserve archaic items. So, understood as an almost fossilized expression of ancient cultural traditions, folklore then becomes strongly tied to ideas about national identity. So while there isn't really time for me to discuss that point at greater length, we can look to the Nazi conception of the Volk and its relation to idealized Germanic cultural and racial purity as one example. Of course, the flaw with this perceived link between folk culture and national identity is that, quote, folk is not an anthropological term, it is an ideological construct, unquote. From the Victorian romanticization of class difference to Nazi ideals of racial and cultural purity, we see folk constructed and reconstructed to serve a variety of different ideological and socio-political agendas. In 21st century scholarship, folklore's older ideological inflections have largely been discarded as outdated and erroneous. Contemporary folklorists no longer view folklore as inherently ancient or exclusive to an isolated racial or socioeconomic stratum. Rather, it's seen more as a fluid, informal practice that adapts to meet the needs of the communities in which it arises. So to conclude, Simpson and Roud have stated that, quote, the notion that folklore is found only or chiefly where an uneducated homogeneous peasantry preserves ancient ways has no relevance to England today and probably never did. It is important to note, however, that the contemporary shifts in understandings of folklore that I've just outlined have occurred primarily within academic contexts. In the following analysis of folklore and popular media, we're going to see that outside the academy, in the less formal context of folkloric media, it's possible to detect the persistence of earlier ideas about folklore. So clearly, discourse on vernacular culture is not restricted to the academic sphere. This is attested to by the existence of folkloric themes and imagery in a wide variety of popular media from the 20th and 21st centuries, including but not limited to music, film and television, and fashion design. In the examples I'm going to be discussing, media signals its folkloric associations by employing familiar themes and iconography which have become recognizable folkloric topoi, or commonplaces. These include depictions of remote rural landscapes and allusions to real or imagined pre-modern customs and beliefs. These topoi are less a reflection of real folk culture, than a replication of early modern and Victorian misconceptions about the vernacular. Nonetheless, such allusions populate contemporary folkloric media, a quote, agglomeration of convincing motifs and forms which function to imbue this media with a veneer of historical authenticity. Take, for example, Britain's musical folk revival, which gained particular momentum following the Second World War, as Britain's post-war economy shifted from austerity to increasing affluence and consumerism. Wanting to push back against consumer culture, as well as the Americanization of British airwaves, musicians sought to revive the musical traditions of Britain's proletariat and rediscover an authentically British sound. Revivalists looked to the rural working classes in particular due to a belief that, quote, folk songs would be found only in those country districts which, by reason of their remoteness, have escaped the infection of modern ideas, unquote. The actual authenticity of the revivalist material is unfortunately undermined by the fact that in many cases, their research was based on folk collections compiled and heavily edited in the Victorian era. So using texts with Victorian corruptions as their source material, the revivalists' entire conception of what constituted Britain's musical heritage was founded in large part on, quote, romanticized 19th century ideas about traditional music. Many of the recognizable topoi that appear in post-war folk music are also present in folkloric film and television productions. For example, we find rural locales and ancient vernacular customs as central features of British films such as The Wicker Man, as well as television programs like A Warning to the Curious and The Children of the Stones. In each of these productions, there's a strong visual and narrative emphasis on rural lifestyles, places, and aesthetics. Remote landscapes serve as the setting for stories that revolve around ancient folkloric artifacts, customs, and legends. The Wicker Man, for instance, brings to life the purported druidic practice of human sacrifice, while A Warning to the Curious focuses on the unearthing of a cursed Anglo-Saxon crown. The narratives of these programs typically follow an outsider, usually an urbanite, who enters, quote, the zone of the countryside. In doing so, the outsider trespasses on the spaces and traditions that are typically reserved for the folk. In all three of the productions I've just listed, the presence of this outsider is unwelcome. The outsider is often punished for their trespass or even driven away. In addition to music, film, and television, folkloric adaptations are also found in contemporary fashion design. For instance, HERESY is a London-based clothing brand that designs streetwear overtly inspired by Britain's folk culture. Launched in 2020 by two illustrators, HERESY Products produces small, seasonal collections of casual streetwear garments like jeans, t-shirts, and hoodies. Analysis of HERESY's website and Instagram account indicate that Britain's rural spaces and vernacular culture play a key role in both design and marketing, as we find folkloric topoi in both the products themselves and in the direction of fashion footage that promotes those products. So HERESY's website offers several illuminating examples of what I'm talking about. Listed for sale are products like the Chalky Lad trousers, which features screen-printed Green Man figures on the front and a small Chalky Lad figure also screen-printed on the back. The Green Man detail is a graphic allusion to the mysterious leafy faces that populate structures throughout Britain. While their origin is unknown, they're believed to have folkloric associations. Whether correctly or not isn't known. The Chalky Lad detail is a visual rendering of the similarly mysterious Long Man of Wilmington. Located on the Sussex Downs, the Long Man is a large-scale hill figure and the subject of local legend. So in addition to actual product design, folkloric themes and imagery are also discernible in photographs and videos that promote HERESY garments. This is the case in footage created for HERESY's Spring-Summer 2020 collection titled Dwelling. The collection includes outerwear in earthy shades of green and brown, as well as a jacket with matching pants, featured here, all of which feature an abstract design of uneven, wobbly spirals and jagged lines. As one reviewer explains, this pattern represents a graphic tribute to prehistoric cave drawings, as, quote, the particular focus for this collection is on the lore that surrounds caves, bogs, hovels, and the people that live in them. Promotional footage for the collection reflects the folkloric theme here, as it's shot inside Surrey's historic Dorking caves. The photographs show a model dressed in pieces from the collection, standing in front of subterranean walls covered in deeply etched graffiti, which testify to centuries of human passage while also visually echoing the abstract pattern on the garments themselves. These examples illustrate the central role that folklore plays in Heresy's fashion design, which is simultaneously taking inspiration from and paying tribute to Britain's vernacular heritage. In both the products and promotional material, the brand's incorporating a wide range of allusions to rural spaces and customs, and we can think of this as a kind of folk pastiche, an assortment of diverse and often unrelated folk material that's then brought together. Heresy utilizes this pastiche to establish a relationship with Britain's past. Admittedly, folkloric media frequently utilizes pastiche in attempting to establish continuity with the past. We see, quote, cultural producers integrate or stitch together folkloric motifs and forms to make a product that appears to be inspired directly by one or more specific traditions. This is typically done to generate an impression of historicity or realism. So this is a difference here with Heresy's use of folklore, because the brand makes no effort to construct a veneer of authenticity. Instead, Heresy's use of folklore is playful and irreverent, generating designs that are decidedly self-reflexive. This approach is particularly evident in the brand's characteristic juxtaposition of folk pastiche and contemporary design elements. The Fable jacket is one notable example. This jacket is covered in watercolor graphics depicting wagon wheels, mushrooms, and crumbling stone ruins. The images, at once pastoral and mysterious, serve as incongruous decorative features for a boxy cotton jacket with metal popper buttons, side vents, and a drawcord at the hem. This piece typifies Heresy's approach to design. Garments are made of sturdy materials like canvas or denim, featuring utilitarian details like zippers, buckles, and nylon cording. These small details are actually the recognizable hallmarks of contemporary workwear and high-performance outerwear of the kind associated with brands like Patagonia, The North Face, and Carhartt. In this juxtaposition of traditional and contemporary material, we find modern design elements kind of serving as a canvas or backdrop that frames and foregrounds the pastiche of folkloric topoi. The folk pastiche reads like a postmodern allusion to the nature of our relationship with the past. Heritage is simply a composite of fragmented associations. In attempts to revive the past, these fragments are simply stitched together to create a veneer of authenticity. The pairing of folkloric imagery and modern design also reminds us that while the amalgamation of disparate historical elements may generate the illusion of historicity, such illusions will necessarily be founded on and shaped by contemporary attitudes and understandings or misunderstandings of the past. In this sense, Heresy's garments are actually designed to emphasize their own constructedness. In doing so, they underscore the extent to which popular ideas about folklore and heritage are themselves modern constructions. This self-reflexive quality is quite uncommon in folkloric media, which frequently tries to conceal and disavow its own artificiality. By actively embracing the idea that modern perceptions and portrayals of heritage are largely creative inventions, Heresy also undermines the significance of historical authenticity, subverting a rigid, monolithic conception of Britain's cultural heritage. Instead, Heresy portrays heritage as, quote, contingent and relational, unquote, something that each person is defining and experiencing differently. We can also think of Heresy's folk pastiche as, quote, a selection of cultural artifacts marked out as worthy of attention, end quote. By foregrounding the proliferation of folkloric topoi, Heresy is essentially insisting on the significance of this material. And in doing so, it's addressing a representational silence. As Jamie Sexton has noted, heritage discourse in Britain is monopolized by large institutions like the National Trust and English Heritage. In the version of British history and culture that these institutions foreground, the traces of ordinary individuals, those without titles and lands, for instance, are frequently overlooked. This lack of representation carries an implicit message that history is an account of remarkable people, but only certain types of people are remarkable. In its designs, HERESY focuses on the rural spaces and people that are often overlooked or actively erased in dominant retellings of the past. So in this sense, the brand utilizes design to generate a counter-narrative to more mainstream accounts of Britain's heritage. This counter-narrative and the shift in historical focus it promotes is an example of what Sexton has referred to as an alternative heritage. Alternative heritages, quote, stem from a changed conception of history. There has been a decline in the strength of a given national history. Instead, a proliferation of alternative or vernacular histories has developed. Through the proliferation of different histories, the supremacy of a dominant historical narrative is challenged. And this opens up the space for the existence of new and equally valid constructions of heritage and identity. As folklore, all folkloric media by definition foregrounds vernacular culture. But this is another key difference between HERESY and the folkloric media I've discussed so far. In the examples of folkloric music and film and TV, we find that paradoxically, and centering cultural material that has often been excluded, folkloric media actually frequently engages in exclusionary practices of its own. So exclusionary practices are evident in Britain's post-war folk revival when we consider that what began as a collective desire to explore heritage ultimately generated, quote, an atmosphere that was governed by the ideal of performing authentic music, unquote. The mandate to perform only appropriately authentic music led to what Britta Sweers describes as, quote, a highly restrictive atmosphere. This exaggerated traditionalism had taken on a very contradictory character as the revival had developed a stricter performance practice than the tradition itself, unquote. In many folkloric film and television productions, similar processes of inclusion and exclusion are literally acted out on screen. We see tension or outright conflict arising when the boundary separating the spheres of urban and rural is transgressed in some way. Urbanites who trespass have to be punished or driven out so that the boundary between these spheres is maintained. In these examples, portrayals of authentic folk culture, defined in relations to factors like rurality and tradition, become the center point of acts of inclusion and exclusion, which can be thought of as bordering processes. According to border theorist Ansi Pazzi, we often think of borders as, quote, monolithic lines at the edges of state territories. Borders, however, may also be sociocultural, manifesting as different, quote, institutions, symbols, practices, and discourses. Just as physical borders are used to differentiate in spatial terms between separate regions, sociocultural borders, quote, create and maintain inclusions and exclusions, divisions between us and them. The attempt to differentiate between us and them, insider and outsider, is in turn, quote, closely related to different constructions of identity, belonging, and citizenship, unquote. Recall that folklore has historically been treated as a reflection of national cultural heritage, and thus also shapes perceptions of national identity. By this token, it's possible to read the effort to establish and maintain the boundaries of British folk culture as an effort to likewise establish and maintain the borders of British identity itself. And because folkloric media both relies on and perpetuates a definition of folklore that is at once restrictive and inaccurate, it risks perpetuating, by extension, a similarly narrow and distorted understanding of what constitutes Britishness. Upholding restrictive definitions of British heritage and identity is particularly deleterious in the context of broader sociopolitical discourse on national identity and citizenship in 21st century Britain. In the wake of Brexit and increasing migration across Europe, Britain has witnessed an increase in nationalism, anti-immigration sentiment, and the popularity of the extreme right. There has been a concomitant increase in bordering processes aimed at regulating British identity. Frequently, we see heritage weaponized in these bordering processes as individuals turn to the past for evidence of an inherent border separating those with a claim to British ancestry and those labeled as the transnational other. These us-them dualisms ultimately serve to strengthen a collective sense of national identity amongst those in the us category. And we can therefore think of them as, quote, substantial ideological tools which are mobilized to convert and redefine the main categories of life, such as identity, belonging, and citizenship. Indeed, these processes of bordering and othering are part of a hegemonic, quote, political process of belonging, end quote, unquote, which is based on a, quote, more elastic notion than ethnicity that states no more than I was here before you, and as such can be applied in any situation and can be constantly redefined, unquote. This creates, quote,
I'm sorry, you have 2 minutes left.
Yeah. This creates, quote, hierarchies of belonging which are only partially related to people's formal citizenship status. So here we see belonging established largely on the basis of a presumed link with the past. To relate this point back to folkloric media, we can see how symbolic bordering processes reinforce restrictive definitions of heritage, contributing to a similarly restrictive understanding of national identity, which is then weaponized in real-world bordering processes. These bordering processes are a form of social, cultural, and political negotiation of belonging, which requires the delineation of an other in order to clearly define an us. Pasi insists that wherever and on whatever scale this othering occurs, the deconstruction of the political and ethical elements of othering must be a critical project that strives towards emancipation from the ideological powers manifesting themselves in various forms of bordering, unquote. So to return to heresy, I argue that this streetwear brand offers an example of folkloric media that answers Pasi's call to action. Using self-reflexive designs that juxtapose folk pastiche and contemporary fashion, heresy draws attention to the fragmentary and constructed nature of our relationship with the past, undermining the supposed border between authentic and inauthentic forms of heritage. Instead, the brand's designs foreground and celebrate the coexistence of diverse vernacular heritages. Heresy garments thus represent a form of alternative heritage, which contests both the centrality and the power of a single hegemonic narrative about national identity and history. Ultimately, heresy emphasizes this emphasis on hybridity in British cultural heritage also suggests that hybridity is, by extension, a fundamental characteristic of British national identity. The centering of hybridity rather than uniformity complicates bordering processes which seek to establish and maintain politically charged divisions between insider, outsider, native, and foreigner. It also reframes British heritages as inclusive rather than exclusive, using the medium of fashion design to address the concepts of heritage and identity. Heresy reinforces the idea that, like one's personal style, these are dynamic, ongoing processes constantly being negotiated and renegotiated on a personal level. So I've tried to draw attention to heresy as a rare example of folkloric media that takes inspiration from and pays tribute to Britain's vernacular culture without relying on or perpetuating false dualisms and mechanisms of othering. As transnational border crossing increases in Britain and around the world, this resistance to the processes of border control is a valid political act in and of itself, but it also provides us with a helpful illustration of how we can celebrate national heritages without actively excluding individuals and groups. And I apologize for just taking a little too long there.
Thank you very much. It was a very rich contribution with very interesting ideas, with contradictions, and also a new sphere. Like in the previous one, we have seen film. Here we were confronted with fashion and with all kinds of ideas related, folklore, tradition, heritage, all very complex and very often fuzzy terms which we are using in this discourse. But I think that's the main idea about this session, to question these, to look at them in detail. With this, we are moving to our third speaker, who is Nicola Carotenuto from Oxford University. And with that, we also turn back to film in some way. He is a PhD student at University Oxford, where he is dealing with true, let's say, medieval topics, namely trade and Venetian merchants in 14th century and the interactions between various institutions and trade, for which obviously the Venetian area is an absolutely crucial thing. And he also did some studies at University of Pisa before, so he's very familiar with all these scenes. But in his present discussion and presentation, is turning to another area of Italy, namely the area which is depicted in a film, Barbarossa, which is of course about the northern Italian zone and a conflict between the emperor. So with this, back to film and how films are related to present day or to historical aspects, whether they are fiction or reality or may well be propaganda. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, the organizer. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I will now, so hopefully you should also, can you see the screen?
We can see it, but it's not centered. We can only see one there. Perfect. There.
I'm only wondering whether, now, what do you see now?
It's fine. It's fine now.
And now, is it fine?
It's okay. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I will speak about Barbarossa, a movie from 2009. The fascination of far-right movements for a mythological path, supposedly heralded as the forerunner of Western civilization, is a well-established field of inquiry. The case study of the Northern League in Italy, with particular reference to the figure of Federico Barbarossa, Frederick I, is indeed a powerful reminder of the ubiquitousness of the recourse to the past to justify the present. In this paper, I will try to explain how the Northern League has repurposed the past of the Italian communes and the history of Barbarossa, and the similarities between these views and past politicization of the conflict between the emperor and the Italian communes, with particular reference to medieval Venice. On July the 27th of 2008, Umberto Bossi, the then leader of the Northern League, declared, "Barbarossa today is not a person, but rather a state, centralized Italy, and I am the new Alberto de Giussano." He then affirmed that the true value of the story had to be found in the appeal to freedom, which, according to him, must be seized by force if necessary. It is better to die than to live as slaves. The reason why Umberto Bossi felt the need to mention Barbarossa alongside Alberto de Giussano was the ongoing production of a movie endorsed by the Northern League, titled Barbarossa, of 2009, a film that purported to be the official consecration of the political ideas of the party. From the onset, the viewer, after a vision of flames, is presented the setting of the scene: Italy, 12th century, the northern land ruled by a German emperor, Friedrich Hohenstaufen, called Barbarossa. His dream is to conquer the lands of central and southern Italy so as to revive Charlemagne's empire. In the lands of the north, there is a young boy from Milan, Alberto de Giussano. His dream is to defeat the emperor and give freedom back to his people. The inventor Alberto de Giussano would have saved the life of the emperor only to be subsequently ashamed by the extortion and injustices of his officials. After the episode, the entire set of modern preconception regarding the Middle Ages is presented. Arbitrary punishment, superstition, mistreatment of women, sorcery, and knights storming the countryside, alongside farcical details such as a music sheet written in an implausible 12th century script, perfectly polished and shining brick houses, a baroque throne, and even dialogues in modern French, with the inevitable love story. The key word of the series is undoubtedly I Milanesi vogliono l'indipendenza. The dweller of Milan aspire to independence, as opposed to the glory of Frederick's universal empire. You can see here the poster of the film, and here the then leader of the League, Umberto Bossi, with actors from the movie. And this is the former logo of Lega Nord, with the symbol of Umberto de Giussano with a shield and the Lion of St. Mark. The emperor marches steadily across the Alps like a new Hannibal, or more like Napoleon, while the communes scramble to defend themselves. The consuls of Milan disdain any compromise with the German ruler, and Milan is protected by the holy influence of the newfound bodies of the three wise men. The armies of the emperor are sabotaged while crossing a river on a floating bridge of ships, and knights in full armor appear to be perfectly able to swim. Alberto de Giussano, just like William of Fibelin in the film Kingdom of Heaven, is portrayed working as a blacksmith and is abruptly informed that the city of Brescia has been destroyed and 1,000 casualties left on the ground. He replies, "We will no longer be slaves." Desperate and unprepared is the city of Milan at the site of Barbarossa, hardly difficult to miss given the horographical details of the era surrounding the place. The siege of the city is clearly reminiscent of the besieging of Jerusalem in Kingdom of Heaven, albeit with far less spectacular special effects. While the emperor is marching southwards, the plague crushes his ambition, while the Compagnia della Morte, a squad of soldiers born to vindicate the oppressed liberty, is formed by the inhabitants of the beleaguered northern city, a sort of reenacting of the adventures of Robin Hood against the perfidious King John. We are indeed driven by the pursuit of freedom, a slogan iteratively repeated by the feasting soldier while acclaiming their leader Alberto da Giussano, happily engaged and unmarried. The epopee ends with the final annihilation of the imperial troops and the standing ovation of the troops of the Italian communes surrounding a carroccio, the carriage representing the League of the Commons. The reaction to the movie were manifold. A large number of scholars have pointed out the numerous anachronisms of the movie. Franco Caldini, for one, has described the historical research behind the film as a ridiculous heap of lies and falsities, in the best scenario, a recycling of a pseudo-historical risorgimento cliché associated to trivial propaganda. Others have ironized about the details of the production of a film purporting to depict the strife to freedom of Italians against the perfidious invaders, given that the movie was shot in Romania and that most of the actors were in fact foreigners. To add insult to injury, the movie was generously financed by the Ministry for Cultural Activities and sponsored by the Italian national broadcaster, RAI. Yet the main criticism has been the weakness of the plot itself and the heavy reliance on previous similar movies and the weaponization of the past for modern political purposes. The Italian film critic was unanimous in presenting it as one of the greatest fiascos of recent times, and the box office confirmed this impression. Il Mattino has spoken of a movie adopted as a cultural, political, and ideological manifesto of the Padania, the northern Italy. Even the right wing, and probably con Il Giornale, labeled it as a Lombard Northern League megalomania. The mainstream Corriere della Sera underscored the absence of Italian actors, as well as of pathos, epopee, and tension, as well as leaps of logic and oversimplification. Liberazione titled "Is it a film or a parody?" mocking the comedian by Boston himself, whereas the Catholic newspaper L'Osservatore Romano did not hesitate to brand it as an indigestible and emphatic meatloaf. It would be tempting to merely dismiss this entire product as a failed attempt of reification of the mythological origins of the Northern League. It is quite ironical that the producer had actually worked in the past on significant social issues for his previous production, and has since tried to present the film more as a general tribute to liberty than as propaganda of Northern League. The then Undersecretary for Infrastructure, Roberto Castelli of Bossi's party, went so far as to vehemently protest against the Italian Association of Film Producers for having advanced Baria by Tornatore over Barbarossa for the Oscar. As he declared in 2009, Barbarossa is poised to be one of the great blockbusters to be ever produced in Italy, and would certainly be worthy of being proposed amongst the movies that will represent Italy at the Oscar ceremony. The choice of a movie portraying Southern Italy and the Communist Party over the Northern League propaganda must have genuinely baffled Castelli. The movie was unabashedly embraced by the Northern League. A trailer was presented in 2009 at the official meeting of the party in Pontida. In the regional video of the event, the official flag of the party, the one that you may see in the background, center on the image of Roberto Giussano, is ostensibly displayed. From the podium, the speaker screams at the end of the trailer, "This were our ancestors who fought for our freedom." A clear link between the fight of the Italian communes and the secession of Northern Italy, spearheaded by the party, is presented to the audience that cheerfully rallies to the cry of freedom and independence. To complete the spectacular presentation of the movie, the film had a bombastic premiere at the Castello Sforzesco in Milan and was gleefully and duly applauded by Bossi, who celebrated the history of a people which has regained freedom. The official newspaper of the party devoted 5 entire pages to the event and gaffed all the leaders of the centre-right. Farcical as it was, the premiere did not draw the attention of Italian media alone. A leaked cablegram of the US consulate in Milan reads as follows, quote, "Regardless of the quality of the film, Barbarossa brings to life the populist and traditional imagery that underscores much of the Northern League, increasing popular appeal among Northern Italian voters. Barbarossa, much like the political party that supported the film's creation is short and subtly and heavily reliant on mythology and folklore symbolism. This flair for dramatic imagery has helped an orphan league to stand out among the ever-evolving and rhetorically boring array of political parties in Italy. Furthermore, as evidenced by the crash of political VAPs at the opening of an otherwise forgettable war movie, the LN leadership has managed to create a relevant and important party. Therefore, for LN supporter, Barbarossa box office success is beside the point. Its existence alone, with its big swing glorification of the Lombard League and its noble fight for liberty from outside rule, underscore the party's most populist and visually resonant themes. End quote. As the US consulate rightly points out, the appeal of this mythological past was quite unique within the landscape of Italian politics. All other parties had their roots in more mainstream European political families. The party could then stand out from the others thanks to its rich imagery in sharp contrast with all other political formations. The quest for origin was indeed celebrated each year at Pontida, where affiliates gathered and celebrated the struggle for freedom from the Italian yoke. Indeed, the event has also vividly visualized the vast array of culture underscoring to the movement: brave style-clad politician, Viking shields, Celtic symbols, and generally medieval armored aficionados. As you can see here, this is Alberto de Giussano on the podium, and this is the then Senator Borghezio with Celtic horns. As a popular song by the band Modena City Ramblers ironized already in 1996 in Giro di Vite Crackdown, in Pontida you could find engineers with a long spear and dentists in full armor. Pontida was indeed the main event of the Lega political calendar, the other being a smaller scale meeting in Venice called the Feast of the People of Padania. The recourse to the past served to reassert the original nature of the Lega, to create a connection with past strives for freedom, and to forge a specific identity of the party. Bereft of Christian values and of liberalist ideology, there was little space for traditional right-wing imaginary in the Lega. As happened with the Front National in France, its obsession for Jeanne d'Arc, obsession for Jeanne d'Arc, the party had defined a founding character, and ironically, it relied on Alberto de Giussano, the alleged leader of a revolt against the emperor. In fact, such figure never existed and was rather forged by Galvano Fiamma, a 14th century Milanese chronicler. There is Marine Le Pen in front of a statue of Jeanne d'Arc. However, the most striking aspect, as Tommaso di Carpegna Falconieri, an Italian scholar who studied extensively the theme, has underscored, is the probably unconscious utilization of 19th century ideology. Truth to be told, most of the ideological underpinnings to the epic struggle between the communes and the emperor derive from the Risorgimento tradition, where ironically they serve as a justification of an anti-Austrian campaign. In the first half of the 19th century, a poem specifically celebrated the event. Giovanni Berchet, an Italian patriot, composed in 1829 an ode titled The Oath of Pontida, which reads, "The Lombard are unanimous, bound together by a league. The invader will die with its blood, the hoisted flag." Much like the famous passage from the Marseillaise, the oath is a potent imaginary construct that underpins classical poems such as March, 1821, and was translated into visual representation by Giuseppe Diotti in 1837 in Cremona, as you may see here. However, ironically, no contemporary document mentions Pontida, and was first mentioned, which actually was first mentioned by a 16th century local historian named Bernardino Corio. However, it is noteworthy that the cultural appropriation by the Northern League, a party that prepared to promote independence from Italy, of a quintessential nationalist tradition that longed for the reunification of Lombardy and Veneto to Italy. Much like the official anthem of the party, Di Va Pensiero by Verdi. There is no need to stress here the endless stream of historical inaccuracies that taints this reconstruction, as they are self-evident. There was certainly not a national ethical struggle against the emperor. There were few joint political goals beyond the fight against him, and no clear-cut dichotomy between the emperor and the Italians. At the end, the doctrine of the regalia was elaborated by jurists from Bologna. The alleged unity of Italian communes was but a myth, and once the fight with the emperor was over, quarrels among cities erupted again. But since my area of expertise is medieval Venice, I would like to highlight a similar weaponization of Barbarossa to political ends in the Middle Ages. Venice had a negligible significance within the uprising of the communes and their leagues. It basically worked as the ultimate lender to the communes and did not wish to be dragged beyond repairs into a conflict with a ruler who was able to jugulate its commercial arteries. The choice of the city for the signing of a truce between the commons, the empire, and the papacy was largely random. and rest on the necessity to find a sufficiently neutral setting. The city of Venice was more easily reachable and conveniently close to both the imperial territories and northern Italy. In truth, this historical event was quite an organizational nightmare for the city. Venice had to be sure about the safe arrival of all the guests and to provide an adequate setting for all the ceremonial acts that would have subsequently taken place. It was not an easy task, especially since Venice itself had papal and imperial factions, but the Venetians themselves were certainly not the mastermind between the peace of 1177. All contemporary accounts focus on the emperor prostrated in front of the pope and ensuring absolution from the excommunication. On September the 18th, in the Church of St. Mark, a synod was summoned to ratify the peace between the empire, the communes, the papacy, and the kingdom of Sicily. The only text to mention the Venetian were the De Pace Veneta Relatio, written by an English witness, which recalls the presence of two great ships with the flag of St. Mark and of a seat for the Patriarch of Venice, in truth, the Patriarch of Grado. The only proactive function of the Venetian is hinted by the text of the Chronicon by Romualdo from Salerno, according to whom a faction of the Venetian plot with the emperor to expedite his arrival in the city. But as soon as the news spread, the Sicilian protested and stupefied Venetian merchant floated to the palace of the Doge, begging him to stop those rumors, which he duly did. Given this historical background, it is all the more surprising that Venetians were able to present a narrative according to which endless honors would have been bestowed upon them, on the city of St. Mark by the Pope and the Emperor. In fact, the only known privilege are some concession to the monasteries of St. Zachary and St. George by the Pope, a reiteration of the traditional commercial agreement with the Empire, and an exemption from the payment of custom fees in the territories of the Empire. Greatness of imagination from such small historical beginnings, one would say. Venetian brazenly affirmed that the ceremony of the wedding of the sea would directly stem from such a prestigious meeting and was attended by the Pope and the Emperor. According to this legend, the Pope would have granted Venice a general indulgence. In fact, when the Venetian Pope Paul II did grant a general indulgence to the city, he specified that, despite lengthy research, he could not find a single papal or authentic document to support the claim of the concession of his predecessor. According to the now lost medieval fresco of the Duke's Palace, the Doge Sebastiano Zani would have been offered to sit alongside the Pope and the Emperor, and the Pontifex would have given to the Doge the insignia, the symbol of power. The Venetian repurposed the historical past to political ends to serve their independence, to justify their political claims, and to achieve this goal, they invented papal indulgences, imperial concessions, and even the arrival of the Pope in the city in disguise. As a finishing touch, they even claim that the Venetian would have fought against the Emperor in a naval battle known as the Fight of Capo Salvore. You can see here a representation of the Doge, the Pope, and the Emperor from a manuscript from the 14th century in the Corriere Museum. And here, at the end, the representation of the Battle of San Salvore by Spinella Aretino in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, circa 407. Much like the Northern League, Venetian employed visual representation to corroborate their claims of independence. For instance, Bonincontro de' Bovi, the Chancellor of the Republic, composed a lengthy poem on the event, which was later illustrated to show the Doges on the throne close to the Pope and the Emperor. The halls of the Maggior Consiglio commemorated the event, and most famously Spinella Aretino has portrayed in 1407 in the Palazzo Pubblico di Siena the history of Frederick and the Pope and the alleged Battle of San Salvore, now Savudria. In short, Venice and the Northern League both employed Barbarossa as a political tool. They both use it to justify claims to independence, but in the case of the former, they use its positive aura to justify their baseless claim, whereas the Northern League has weaponized the past against the Emperor to support its vision of the independence of Northern Italy. I hope to have clarified with this comparison the importance of medievalism and of a thorough examination of the past. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much for this also very interesting contribution. Showing
Joshka,
that...
sorry, before we begin with the questions, we have only 10 minutes left, but if it is okay with the panelists, we can maybe go 10 minutes over time until 12:40, if that is okay with all of you. So that way we have a little bit more time for discussion. In the meantime, I will ask the panelists, of course, if they want to, you can share your emails in the chat box so people can send you questions that they don't get to ask here during the panel. And the floor is yours again, Joshka. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, participants can write questions or comments in the chat. While we are getting some questions from there, I would like to raise a few points, and of course then the panelist has got also the opportunity to ask or to comment each other's paper as well, answering questions. So my first comment and question is for Anna. I found it very interesting, the example, what you have used, and also this very good and critical approach to the understanding of folklore, how folklore has changed its meaning and what kind of perceptions we have got now. I also would like to add to this, that is one of my comments, that heritage is going through something similar. So we are not anymore that traditional heritage concept, that this is all wonderful thing what we have inherited from the past, and it is our beautiful task to protect it for the future and things like that. So if you look into fields like critical heritage studies, their concepts are also much more complex. And you also mentioned alternative heritage, which I find a good category here. But I would also suggest that at one point you can look into these ideas like living heritage, experienced heritage. So instead of the static heritage concept, whose heritage we are talking about and things like that. Now, connected to this, my question is that yes, one more other point, HERESY. It's quite interesting that the company selects a name like this. And just I would like to refer that, for example, in academia, we are now less and less convinced that heresy is a good term to explain the thing for which it has been used, but that's just a side comment. There was one term which I did not hear in your presentation, and I wonder what is your opinion about that, and that is fashion. Because we are talking about folklore, heritage, bordering, lots of very interesting ideas. But this is a company which is operating, let's say, in the fashion sphere. So what do you think about this aspect?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think one of the things that I tried to kind of touch on just right at the end was that I felt it's important, or just that there's some particular value in the fact that that the brand approaches the topics and issues they approach through the medium of fashion, because that's such an inherently personal, expressive, and sort of participatory, ongoing thing. It's a process. It's never static. You are always changing your clothes. And I also think that what you wear, for some at least, is how you interface with other people as well. Like, it's an important way of showing what you care about, or what you think, or what kind of person you are. So I felt that made their use of folklore different. It's really just, it's not the same as a film where you just watch a film, or even music where you hear the music. Like, the clothing you wear has a very personal element to it in a way that a lot of other folkloric media doesn't. So I think that's one thing that I thought about fashion in this context.
Yeah, what I meant by this, that I agree with this point, but what about it's a market, simply to look at it as a market strategy? I mean, right. There were cases when very big fashion companies actually used, let's say, folkloric motifs. There were big scandals about it, and contradictions, including copyright and things like that, which makes it very crazy. But it is, a very crowded scene where you have to develop a positive market strategy. So right. I don't know the actual background of this particular company, but that is an aspect which should also be taken into consideration.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. And so the paper that I delivered just now one of the reasons I had trouble fitting it in was that it was condensed from a journal-length article. And in that, I did actually discuss some other examples of folkloric fashion that were actually high fashion. So brands like for Vivienne Westwood or Alexander McQueen that are very expensive. It's like, it's really kind of funny or odd that, you know, they appropriate sort of images of the folk that are like, you know, peasant imagery, let's say, that are, you know, a single shirt costs $1,000 or something. It's not affordable for the average person. So there's this glaring kind of inappropriateness almost. And even, I mean, admittedly, Heresy's clothing is not in my budget, actually. But I think that to a certain extent, you can try and justify that by saying that they try to make their clothing very ethically. And so that leads to the higher prices. Someone I was thinking about a lot as I wrote about Heresy was William Morris, because and I don't know a ton about William Morris, but I always was struck by the fact that his stuff was expensive, like, you know, and his shops would be in high streets, and not everyone could have these nice things, even though he had this kind of like for the people attitude. But I guess the price then gets partially justified by the quality, because these are things that could theoretically last you forever. So those are just some thoughts that I have in response. And I don't have, you know, a clear-cut answer to kind of your observations, but it's a great point and was definitely on my mind.
Yeah, so I agree that you can take, and the Morris point is actually quite interesting in this respect. I also have got a question for Nicola. You know, my real question is about the movie. I mean, it was very interesting how you contextualize, but what I actually found when I saw first the movie and I looked some scenes now back, first of all, it has a very weak story. So it doesn't really have a story. So I think for a good movie, you either have a good story, or it's very spectacular, or of course some kind of things like this. And it doesn't have a story. I think it's not really spectacular. So I mean, and what I found strange, that having heard your presentation, I mean, if you just bring together all these things, let's say the very historical issues connected to this thing, it's a much more interesting story than the story of the actual film. So my question, maybe you can't answer this. So why, I don't know, these people who created this movie, why they were not interested or were not able to really bring together an interesting story? It's very schematic. It's, you know, you already after, I would say 10 minutes, you would know what it is all about in a way.
Yeah, I do agree. Also because it's one of the very few visual representation of Barbarossa stories. So this would have been a sort of groundbreaking movie. So it could have easily been a blockbuster if they had like actually worked on the plot. My impression, yeah, is that the plot is very weak. At the end, it's just a love story set in the 12th century, and there is not much more than this. My impression is that the movie is more like a sort of pastiche of previous topoi rather than a coherent plot. So you have, for example, the Robin Hood, the sort of like the Squadra La Monte. So you have Robin Hood against King John. Then you have the besieging of the city, which is really reminiscent of Kingdom of Haven. So my impression is that they just put together a sort of like previous filmography, and then they try to shape something from that. And my general impression is that this movie is not really interested to try to give any sort of value to the historical fact, but we are just trying to portray the sort of propaganda of the importance of the strive for liberty. So this at the end, I think, is the main flow of the movie, that to do that, it actually obscures any sort of plot, and the movie actually does not stand together in any way. So it's boring, the special effects are really cheap, and I think it's quite ironical that the movie was shot in Romania, and that about 4/5 of the actors were in fact foreigner and not Italian, given the sort of propaganda surrounding the movie. So I think
That's
that
about money, of course.
yeah,
They
but
can
that's
get
about
a
money because
cheaper movie, so that's clear.
yeah. So I think this roughly the answer. So I don't think they actually wanted to build something with a strong with a sort of strong plot. They just wanted to assemble previous story, then present them as the strive for freedom. This is the main message of the movie.
Right. Thank you very much. I don't know whether we have got any comments, questions in the chat which can be raised.
Francis has a question, but I mean, since you're one of the panelists, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question directly.
Okay, well, no, I had lots of things that came up from both of them, actually. As I was noticing, like, for instance, the term folk as a, how was I saying? The popular use of folklore sounds almost like a, how should I put it, a redundancy, because that is basically the meaning of folklore, is how the people use their general practices. Now, what happens, what is interesting when you're talking about music, was I was beginning to note this on the side here, how the folk and popular music fed upon each other. There was the Breton singer Alan Stivell, who was very much into that, very ethnically oriented music, noted for saying the Beatles were one of the first groups to actually use English music as part of their repertoire and their structure. So in fact, popular becomes much more a way of reusing ideas, and there's also an interesting back and forth from high to low and low to high, again using the Breton images. The Breton dresses were actually a Parisian invention, which went to Brittany, which came back, and so on. I like the final thing is the use of heresy, and I don't know if you've ever read Chesterton's Heretics, because he goes on a lot about that and the very problems of you might say the fashionable use of the word heretic, whereas he's actually saying that, well, you know, it's not your opinion, then it probably isn't your opinion, and it's probably wrong. Anyhow, he goes into the whole problematic about how heresy becomes an orthodoxy where it isn't in Europe. I wonder if that doesn't happen as well. We'll start with that, and then I'll get my little note for Nicola. What I was interested in was he's pointing out how the producers toned down some of the nationalism or ultra-nationalism, which makes me think a lot of how Griffith toned down the original Tom Dixon novel for his Birth of a Nations, and yet it still remains a politically charged film and problematic, which, by the way, it comes to always a constant use, especially from the far right, of a sort of policy of self-victimization. Everybody's against me and wants to attack me and things like that. They play that against everybody else. And, it doesn't always work, but it is what they do a lot of that. Last little thing, I was noticing the oath of Horatio in the painting that you gave us. Okay, so I'll let Anne answer first.
Thank you. So maybe Anne or Nicola would like to comment on this.
I think it's very ironical that they actually weaponize a sort of nationalistic tradition that actually was born in the 19th century to justify the annexation of Lombardy and Veneto to Italy against the same goal, which is, I don't know whether this was done on purpose or it's a bit controversial, because like the historiography right now is debating this, whether it was a conscious sort of reappropriation or not. But I always found strange, for example, that the official anthem of Lombardy is like the Vappenstiere, which is actually used to be a sort of alternate official anthem of Italy for a long time. Like in the 19th century, it was one of the Song of the Patriots of the insurrection against the Austrians. So I think it's quite strange, and this is something that should be investigated, whether it was a conscious reappropriation of the past that then was repurposed, or whether this was just a coincidence and they were just part of a historical continuum and they unconsciously just reappropriated previous images. But the fact is that it's quite strange, because it's a sort of unicum within the. It's really, this recourse to the past is quite unique within the political spectrum of Italy. And now that the Northern League has shifted from that position, actually they are gradually relinquishing this heritage. It's also an evolving process, and so right now, for example, Italy has abandoned massive recourse to the past. So I wonder whether this was conscious or unconscious. Something I didn't have an answer to, but of course, some of you may have a better answer than mine.
Okay, thank you very much. Wow, there is a very long comment, I believe, from Vanya. Would you like to phrase that one, or?
Yeah, if you want me to elaborate orally, I can, because it's really long comment, but it's actually the main idea is about this relationship between the Lega Nord and the medieval past, or this 19th century medievalism. And I wonder how much of that is a reaction against, Italy's a traditional relationship with the Roman past, in fact. So the Middle Ages is just, one way to stand out and do something, different. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that. And also, in my experience, and, I'm a Venetian, so I was born in Venice. I lived in Veneto most of my life. And actually, this conference is one of the first few instances in which I heard about this movie. So besides some newspapers, actually the public resonance, even in circles that I've been exposed to, which sometimes have been, very right-wing, this movie got completely glossed over to some extent. Is that, once again, about the fact that Italy does not really care about its medieval past. So any form of medievalism is actually, not really even worth demystifying or deconstruct. So yeah, I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on this very general question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, before Nicola begins, because we're short of time, I will also like to pose a question to Francis, and maybe they can answer it together, and then we can close the panel, if that's okay with you. I mean, I wanted to ask you, Francis, because of course you mentioned the influence, of course, of the political context of each one of the Henry V productions and the way of the representation. You talked about the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, and such. And of course, the question then that would naturally bring to mind, I don't know if you know, is how, for example, the whole context of Brexit has, if you are aware, has influenced this type of representations. In the end, Henry V is a warrior king, better remembered for his crushing victory over the French. One could claim, I mean, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the intention of the producers, but of course, France is one of the founding members of the European Union. So I don't know if maybe you have some opinions regarding this issue. So maybe Nicola can answer first, and then Francis.
I will try to be very brief. So I agree that medievalism is not actually a big thing in Italy, but I don't think that there is the Northern League, I think, had to stand up from other parties. So whereas other parties have, still today, tend to reclaim a sort of Roman heritage, I would say that in this case, medievalism, it's a sort of very strange medievalism because it's a sort of melange of different traditions. So you have Viking shields, Braveheart style, and then you have a Velto da Giussano, 14th century Castello Sforzesco. So it's a sort of melange of generally medieval. My impression is that they just wanted to stand out from other parties. So I don't think that it's a reaction to the Roman past, but more like an alternative, because we had to stand out from other parties. Also because in the far right, it's quite usual to have a sort of recourse to the Roman past. It's much more unusual to have a sort of recourse to this other population. And my impression is that we wanted to select those population as a sort of reminiscence of past battles for liberty by oppressed people. So this is what held together all this haphazardly mixed bunch of different traditions. This is short. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Francis.
No, just to answer the question, the Brexit question. Two things. For one thing, it takes a while to make a movie, so I don't know if they've done a Brexit Henry V yet. They probably won't. There's also theater that may have done things around that. But also, in some ways, the Hollow Crown version is something of the Brexit Henry V, because it was shot in 2012, which was the year London swiped the Olympic Games from Paris. So there was kind of that little play of, oh, we got it, nah, 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 type thing. Like they were very proud of that. So they developed the entire Hollow Crown English Kings series as part of that, and in many ways, closing the original series with the Henry V has a political resonance that is that's quite obvious in some ways.
Thank you very much. I think with all these comments, we can see that when they're talking about something very medieval, you just can't escape to influence present-day politics or ideas or fashion or other aspects of life, which is obviously the main point of this conference and the very session as well. I would like to say thank you again for the 3 presenters in this session. And I also would like to remind you that the program is not yet over. In a few minutes' time, a last session will start with also very interesting contribution. At that time, it's not so much about film, movie, and things like that, but all kinds of games and other interesting things which are so much 21st century aspects. With that, I would like to say goodbye and thank you for also for the organizers to bring together this very interesting program.